I've decided to start a new life without Margaret." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud at the Riverside View restaurant. 60 guests sat frozen, champagne glasses halfway to their lips. My daughter Sarah's graduation cap slipped sideways as her face crumpled. The clinking of silverware stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence. I smiled. "Congratulations on your honesty, Richard." "Hello, I'm Margaret Thompson." What you just heard was my husband of 32 years announcing our divorce at our daughter's college graduation dinner. That envelope I handed him? It contained the beginning of the most satisfying revenge story you'll ever hear. Now, if you've ever wondered what you'd do if your husband betrayed you in the most public, humiliating way possible, this story is for you. Because sometimes, ladies, the worst day of your life becomes the best thing that ever happened to you. But let me back up for just a moment. 32 years of marriage. I'm 55 years old. And I'd known about Richard's affair for 6 months. 6 months of watching him plan his grand exit while I planned something entirely different. You see, Richard thought he was being clever. He thought he had it all figured out. What he forgot was that his wife had been a financial professional for 25 years. He forgot that I understood money trails, legal documents, and most importantly, I remembered every single detail of that prenuptial agreement he'd insisted we sign back in 1991. Let me paint you the full picture of that restaurant scene, because it was truly something to behold. We were at the Riverside View, Portland's most elegant restaurant, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Columbia River. I'd chosen it specifically for Sarah's celebration, and unknowingly, Richard had chosen it for his announcement. The irony wasn't lost on me later. Our families filled 3 large tables. Sarah sat to my right, radiant in her cap and gown, a summa cum laude graduate from Oregon State with a degree in marketing. She'd worked so hard, juggling 2 part-time jobs while maintaining her grades. I was so proud of her. To my left sat Richard's sister Carol, who'd flown in from Denver. She'd been giving Richard strange looks all evening, looks I now understood. Behind us, my college roommate Linda with her husband Tom. Richard's business partners. My former colleagues from Morrison & Associates accounting firm. And at the back table, trying to blend into the shadows, sat Jessica Miller. 35 years old, blonde, Richard's colleague from the architectural firm. I'd invited her myself 3 weeks earlier. Jessica should come celebrate Sarah's achievement, I'd told Richard. After all, you two have been working so closely together on that downtown project. The color had drained from his face, but he couldn't object without raising suspicion. Now, here we were. Richard had stood up, ostensibly to make a toast to Sarah. Instead, he dropped his bomb. The silence stretched on. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Carol's mouth fell open. Linda reached over and gripped my hand under the table. Everyone expected tears. Screaming. A dramatic scene. The scorned wife falling apart in public. Instead, I reached into my purse, a vintage Coach bag I'd bought myself for my 50th birthday, and pulled out a cream-colored envelope. I placed it gently beside Richard's untouched salmon. "What's this?" he asked, his triumphant expression faltering. "Something for you to read later," I replied, my voice steady as a rock. I turned to Sarah, whose face had gone pale. I kissed her cheek. "I am so proud of you, sweetheart. This day is still about your accomplishment." Then I stood, smoothed my navy dress, the one Richard had complimented that morning, and addressed our stunned guests. "Please enjoy your meal. I wish you all a lovely evening." With that, I walked out of the restaurant, my head held high, feeling 60 pairs of eyes following my every step. The heavy oak door swung shut behind me, cutting off the beginning of anxious murmurs. Outside, the June evening air hit me like freedom itself. For the first time in months, I could breathe freely. Behind me, I heard the restaurant door bang open and slam shut, followed by Richard's voice, no longer confident, but high-pitched and frantic. "Margaret, what the hell is this? What have you done?" I kept walking to my car, allowing myself a small smile. The envelope contained copies of divorce papers that had been filed that morning, photographs of Richard and Jessica at various romantic locations around Portland, and highlighted sections of our prenuptial agreement, specifically the parts about infidelity and asset division. You see, ladies, while Richard had been planning his dramatic exit, I'd been planning something much more thorough. Let me tell you why this moment felt so incredibly satisfying. For 6 months, I'd watched my husband of 3 decades lie to my face daily. I'd watched him spend our money on another woman. I'd seen him make plans for a future that didn't include me, all while pretending to be the devoted family man. He'd chosen to humiliate me publicly, thinking I'd be too shocked and hurt to respond effectively. He'd calculated that a public setting would prevent me from making a scene. What he hadn't calculated was that I'd had 6 months to prepare. 6 months to consult with attorneys, gather evidence, and plan my own exit strategy. The prenuptial agreement he'd forced me to sign 32 years ago, the one he'd insisted upon when he inherited money from his father and was worried about protecting his assets, that agreement was about to become his worst nightmare. You see, Richard had always been the dreamer in our relationship, the big picture guy, the one who made grand gestures and bold announcements. I was the practical one, the detail person, the one who read the fine print. And the fine print in our prenuptial agreement had a very specific clause about fidelity. A clause that would cost Richard everything he thought he was so cleverly protecting. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how this all started, because the signs were there long before that restaurant scene. The question is, how many of us choose to see them? Have you ever had that feeling, ladies? That something just isn't right? That nagging sensation in your gut that your partner is hiding something? I want you to think about that as I tell you this story, because your instincts are usually right. They're always right. Richard thought he was being so careful, so clever. He thought he could plan his escape right under my nose, and I'd never see it coming. What he didn't know was that I'd been watching, I'd been documenting, and I'd been planning my own surprise. That envelope at the restaurant? That was just the beginning. Let me take you back to where it all began, because understanding how we got to that restaurant moment requires knowing who we were before everything fell apart. 32 years ago, I was Margaret Caldwell, a 23-year-old accounting major at the University of Oregon. I had plans, ladies, big plans. I was going to graduate, get my CPA, and open my own financial consulting firm, specializing in helping women manage their money. This was 1991, remember. Women still struggled to get business loans, to be taken seriously in finance. I wanted to change that. Then I met Richard Thompson at a campus coffee shop. He was 25, already working as a junior architect, charming in that confident way that makes you feel like you're the only person in the room. Dark hair, bright smile, and dreams as big as the Pacific Northwest sky. He was designing sustainable buildings before it was trendy, talking about creating communities that worked in harmony with nature. He fell hard. We'd sit for hours at that little coffee shop on 13th Street. It's a Starbucks now, but back then it was called The Daily Grind. Richard would sketch building designs on napkins while I balanced my checkbook with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. We were opposite personalities, but it worked. He dreamed big. I made sure the dreams had solid financial foundations. "You're going to be my secret weapon, Margaret," he'd say, pulling me close. "Behind every successful man is a woman who knows how to manage money." I should have paid more attention to the word behind. We married in June 1992, right after my graduation. It was a small ceremony at his family's church in Salem. His parents had passed away years earlier, but his sister Carol helped plan everything. My parents, practical people from Eugene, liked Richard well enough, though my mother privately worried he was too much of a dreamer. "Just make sure you keep your own bank account, honey," she whispered to me at the reception. "A woman should always have her own money." I laughed it off then. We were in love. We were partners. Why would I need my own money when we were building a life together? Oh, how naive I was. The first few years were actually wonderful. Richard worked at a small architectural firm downtown, and I got my CPA and took a position at Morrison & Associates, one of Portland's most respected accounting firms. We bought a little house in the Laurelhurst neighborhood, a 1920s craftsman that needed work but had good bones. Richard saw its potential immediately. "We'll restore it room by room," he said, running his hands along the original hardwood floors. "This will be our forever home." I believed him. We tried for children right away, but it took us 5 years and 2 heartbreaking miscarriages before Sarah came along in 1998. Those losses nearly broke me, and Richard was wonderful during those dark times. He held me while I cried, reminded me we had time, that we were young. When Sarah finally arrived, healthy, beautiful, perfect, I thought our family was complete. Richard was a good father in those early years. He'd carry Sarah around the house, showing her his architectural drawings, telling her about the buildings Daddy was designing. He'd read to her every night, making up voices for all the characters in her bedtime stories. But here's where the pattern started, though I didn't recognize it then. Richard got restless. The first time was when Sarah was 2. He came home one evening and announced he was quitting his job to start his own firm. "I'm tired of making other people's visions come to life," he said. "It's time for Richard Thompson Architects to exist." I was supportive. A good wife should support her husband's dreams, right? I crunched the numbers, figured out how long our savings would last, took on extra clients at Morrison to cover our expenses while he built his business. For 3 years, I worked 60-hour weeks while managing a toddler and keeping our household running. Richard's firm struggled. He landed a few small residential projects, but nothing substantial. He'd spend days at his drafting table, designing elaborate buildings that existed only in his imagination. When Sarah was 5, he came home with another announcement. "I'm thinking of switching to commercial real estate development. Architecture is too limiting." This time, I hesitated. "Richard, we just spent 3 years building your architecture practice. Sometimes you have to know when to pivot, Margaret. Successful people adapt." So I adapted. I helped him close the architecture firm, took another promotion at Morrison that required even longer hours, and watched him dive into real estate development with the same passionate intensity he'd brought to architecture. This pattern would repeat itself 4 more times over the next 20 years. Richard Thompson, the serial entrepreneur, the man with a new passion every few years, the dreamer who needed his practical wife to fund his dreams. Each time, I'd be the one working extra hours to keep us afloat financially. Each time, I'd postpone my own plans to open that consulting firm. Each time, I'd tell myself, after this venture succeeds, then I'll focus on my career. But here's what I didn't see clearly until much later. Richard wasn't actually trying to build something lasting. He was trying to find himself. Over and over again. And each time he reinvented himself professionally, he seemed to need to reinvent himself personally too. There were signs. Looking back, Little things that seemed innocent at the time. The way he'd suddenly become interested in fitness when he was 42, spending hours at the gym and buying expensive workout clothes. The way he'd started caring more about his appearance. Hair products, designer shirts, cologne that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. The way he'd begun talking about living authentically and not settling for ordinary. I was too busy managing our finances and raising Sarah to pay close attention. When you're juggling a demanding career and motherhood while your husband pursues his latest passion project, you don't have energy to analyze every mood shift. Besides, I loved him. We had history. We had Sarah. We had built a life together in that beautiful Laurelhurst house, which we'd renovated room by room just like he'd promised. I thought we were solid. By the time Sarah started high school, I'd been promoted to senior manager at Morrison. I was handling major corporate accounts, managing a team of junior accountants, earning more than Richard had in any of his ventures. But I still thought of my career as secondary to his dreams. Once Sarah graduates and Richard's current business stabilizes, I'd tell myself, then I'll finally start my own firm. Sarah was brilliant, just like her father, but practical like me. She excelled in school while working part-time jobs to save for college. She saw how hard I worked to support the family, though I tried to shield her from the financial stress of Richard's constant career changes. "Mom," she said to me once when she was 16, "why don't you ever do anything just for you?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "I mean, Dad gets to reinvent himself every few years, try new things, follow his passions. What about your passions?" I didn't have a good answer. Somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten I had passions beyond making sure everyone else's dreams came true. That should have been my wake-up call. My own daughter could see what I couldn't, or wouldn't, admit to myself. I was disappearing, not all at once, but slowly, like morning fog lifting from the Columbia River. Each year, a little more of Margaret Caldwell faded away, replaced by Richard Thompson's wife, Sarah Thompson's mother, the woman who made sure everyone else's life ran smoothly. Don't get me wrong, I loved being a wife and mother, but I'd given up so much of myself in the process that I wasn't sure who I was anymore outside of those roles. Richard seemed to sense this shift too, though he interpreted it differently. "You've gotten so serious, Margaret," he'd say. "You used to be more fun." Fun? When did I stop being fun? When did paying bills and managing schedules and planning for retirement become my primary identity? When did I become the person who worried about money while Richard chased dreams? The irony is that I was actually very good at managing money. Our retirement accounts were healthy, despite Richard's entrepreneurial adventures. We owned our house outright. Sarah's college fund was fully funded. I'd built us a secure financial foundation that could weather any storm. What I hadn't built was a plan for my own happiness. By Sarah's senior year of high school, I was 54 years old and had been telling myself someday for over 2 decades. Someday I'd start my own business. Someday I'd travel. Someday I'd figure out who Margaret was, beyond wife and mother. Richard, meanwhile, was on venture number 6, importing sustainable building materials from Europe. He'd partnered with a younger crowd of environmental entrepreneurs, attending networking events and conferences that seemed to energize him in ways that home life no longer did. I should have paid more attention to who he was networking with. I should have asked more questions about those late meetings and weekend conferences. I should have trusted the little voice in my head that whispered, "Something's changed." But I was busy. Sarah was applying to colleges, and I was helping her navigate financial aid forms while managing my heaviest client load ever at Morrison. I was also secretly researching what it would take to finally start my own consulting firm once Sarah left for college. For the first time in decades, I was making plans for Margaret. I had no idea that Richard was making plans too. Plans that didn't include me. You know what's funny, ladies? All those years I spent being the practical one, the responsible one, the one who managed the details, while Richard dreamed big dreams. It never occurred to me that my practical skills would someday be exactly what I needed to protect myself. All that experience managing money, understanding legal documents, keeping meticulous records, building relationships with financial professionals. I thought I was just being a good wife. I was actually preparing for war. I just didn't know it yet. It started with a restaurant charge I didn't recognize. The 15th of December, 2022. I was reviewing our monthly credit card statement, something I'd done religiously for 30 years, when I saw it, Le Pigeon, $247.83. Now, Le Pigeon is Portland's most romantic restaurant. Intimate lighting, award-winning French cuisine, the kind of place you go for anniversaries or special celebrations. Richard and I had been there exactly once, for our 20th anniversary, and I remembered the bill being painful even then. But the 15th of December wasn't our anniversary. It wasn't my birthday. It wasn't any occasion I could think of. I asked Richard about it that evening, while he was reading in his study. "Oh, that," he said without looking up from his book. "Client dinner. You know how these sustainable materials buyers are. They expect to be wined and dined." It was a reasonable explanation. Richard had always spent money on client entertainment, and his new import business required building relationships with European suppliers. But something nagged at me. Maybe it was 25 years of professional experience with financial discrepancies. Maybe it was instinct. But that charge felt wrong. I made a mental note to pay closer attention. 2 weeks later, there was another one. Cartier Jewelry Store. $1,247. Early Christmas shopping, Richard explained when I asked. "I wanted to surprise you with something special this year." Christmas morning came and went. No Cartier gift appeared under our tree. When I gently asked about it, Richard claimed he'd decided to return it because it wasn't quite right and was looking for something else. By January, the pattern was unmistakable. Expensive restaurant charges on days when Richard said he was working late. A men's clothing store purchase of $800, but no new clothes appeared in his closet. Gas charges from stations near the Lloyd district, where Richard had no business clients. And then there were the changes in Richard himself. Ladies, have you ever watched someone you've lived with for decades suddenly become different? Not dramatically, but in small ways that add up to something significant? Richard started going to the gym. This wasn't entirely unusual. He'd had fitness phases before, but this time felt different. He was there every morning at 5:30 a.m., sometimes going back again after work. He bought new workout clothes, expensive athletic wear that seemed more focused on appearance than performance. He started caring about his appearance in ways he never had before. New cologne, not the Old Spice he'd worn for years, but something expensive and musky that I didn't recognize. Hair products that promised to fight aging and restore youthful vitality. A skincare routine that involved more products than I used. He bought a new wardrobe. Gone were the comfortable khakis and polo shirts he'd worn for years, replaced by fitted jeans, stylish button-downs, jackets that looked like they belonged on a man 10 years younger. "I'm just trying to look more professional," he explained when I commented on the changes. "Image matters in business." But the biggest change was his energy level. After years of seeming settled, maybe even a little tired, Richard was suddenly vibrant again. He hummed while getting ready for work. He stayed up late on his phone, typing messages with the kind of focused intensity I hadn't seen since the early days of our marriage. He started talking about living authentically and not settling for ordinary and making the most of the years we have left. These phrases felt like arrows aimed directly at our life together. "Don't you ever feel like we're just going through the motions, Margaret?" he asked one evening in February. "Like we're sleepwalking through life?" The question stung, because there was truth in it. We had fallen into comfortable routines. Dinner at 6:30, news at 7, bed by 10. Weekend errands and household projects. Social gatherings with the same circle of friends we'd known for decades. But I didn't see our routines as sleepwalking. I saw them as the reward for 30 years of building something together. The comfortable phase that comes after you've weathered the storms and earned the right to stability. Richard apparently saw them as a prison. In March, I noticed he was working late more frequently. Not just occasionally, but 3 or 4 nights a week. When I'd call his office, his assistant would say he was in meetings or on site at a project location. But his business importing sustainable materials was mostly administrative, paperwork, phone calls with European suppliers, coordinating shipments, what meetings, what project locations. I started paying closer attention to our joint bank account. This is where my professional training became invaluable, ladies. When you've spent 25 years analyzing financial statements and tracking money flows, you develop an eye for patterns. You notice when deposits don't match the expected amounts. You spot transfers that don't align with usual business practices. Richard had always handled his business accounts separately, which was normal and sensible. But our joint account was where his business profits were deposited, where we paid our household expenses, where I could see the overall financial picture of our life together. Starting in January, those deposits were smaller than expected. Not dramatically smaller, but consistently so. If Richard's business was doing well enough to justify expensive client dinners and new clothes, why were the profits declining? I started keeping notes. Old habits, from my auditing days, documenting discrepancies, tracking patterns, building a timeline of irregularities. The 15th of March. Restaurant charge, Andina, $156. Richard said he was working late on European contracts. The 22nd of March. Nordstrom, $340. Richard claimed he needed professional attire for upcoming client meetings. The 28th of March. Gas station in Beaverton, $45. Richard had no reason to be in Beaverton. The 2nd of April. Powell's Books, $87. When I asked if he'd bought something interesting, he seemed confused and said he couldn't remember making any book purchases. By April, I was conducting a full-scale investigation of my own husband. I felt terrible about it, like I was violating his privacy, betraying the trust that marriage is supposed to be built on. But the alternative was pretending I didn't notice the lies, and I'd reached a point where the lies were becoming impossible to ignore. The breakthrough came when Richard left his phone unlocked on the kitchen counter while he went to shower. I want to be clear about something, ladies. I'm not proud of what I did next. In 30 years of marriage, I had never looked through Richard's phone, never read his emails or checked his messages. I believed in privacy, in trust, in giving your partner the benefit of the doubt. But sometimes, when someone is lying to you consistently and obviously, you reach a point where protecting yourself becomes more important than protecting their privacy. I picked up the phone. The text messages were right there on the screen. Can't wait to see you tonight. Same place? J. Yes, 7 p.m. I told M I have a late meeting. R. How much longer do we have to sneak around like this? J. After Sarah's graduation. I promise, everything changes after graduation. R. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through more messages. Weeks of conversations, plans for dinner dates, discussions about weekend getaways, references to when we can finally be together openly. And then I found the photos. Richard and a woman I didn't recognize. sitting close together at what looked like Le Pigeon. Richard and the same woman walking hand in hand along the waterfront. Richard kissing this woman in what appeared to be the lobby of a downtown hotel. The woman was young, maybe mid-30s, blonde hair, bright smile, the kind of effortless style that comes from having disposable income and no children to chase around. She was beautiful in that polished, professional way that made me suddenly aware of my own middle-aged reflection in the black phone screen. I scrolled back through the messages, looking for her name. Jessica. Jessica Miller. The name sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it immediately. Then I remembered. Richard had mentioned working with a Jessica on some sustainable building project downtown. Brilliant architect, he'd said. Really innovative thinking about environmentally conscious design. I'd been happy that Richard was collaborating with other professionals. I thought it was good for his business. I had no idea she was half his age and sleeping with him in downtown hotels while I balanced our checkbooks and planned our retirement. Standing in my kitchen, holding my husband's phone, reading evidence of his affair, I felt something I hadn't expected. I felt angry. Not heartbroken. That would come later. Not devastated, though that was lurking underneath. I felt furious. For 6 months, I'd been questioning my own instincts, wondering if I was being paranoid, feeling guilty for suspecting Richard of lying, making excuses for financial discrepancies and behavioral changes that my professional training should have flagged immediately. But I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't being a suspicious, controlling wife. I was being lied to, systematically, deliberately, by a man who was stealing from our joint accounts to fund his midlife crisis romance, while I worked 60-hour weeks to maintain the financial stability he was busy undermining. I took screenshots, dozens of them, not because I knew what I was going to do with them, but because my professional instincts kicked in. Document everything. Then I put the phone back exactly where Richard had left it and went to my study. I had work to do. For 30 years, I'd been the detail person in our marriage. The one who read contracts carefully, who researched major purchases, who planned for contingencies. Richard always joked that I was obsessively thorough about legal and financial matters. Thank God one of us actually reads those things, he'd say when I'd spend hours reviewing mortgage documents or insurance policies. Well, Richard was about to discover just how thoroughly I read things. I pulled out our filing cabinet and found the folder labeled Marriage Documents. Inside was our marriage certificate, our wills, and our prenuptial agreement. 31 years old, but still legally binding. I'd forgotten how detailed it was. Richard had insisted on it when we got engaged because he'd inherited a substantial sum from his father's estate and wanted to protect it. I'd been hurt at the time. What young woman wants to plan for divorce before she's even married? But I'd signed it because I loved him and wanted him to feel secure. Now I read every page with the analytical eye of a financial professional. Section 12. Division of assets in case of dissolution. Section 15. Circumstances affecting asset division. Section 18. Infidelity clause. And there it was, in black and white legal language that I'd signed but never expected to need. In the event that dissolution of marriage is caused by proven infidelity of either party, the offending party shall forfeit their claim to 80% of marital assets, including but not limited to real property, retirement accounts, and business interests. 80%. Richard had insisted on this clause to protect himself if I ever cheated. The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh. Almost. I sat in my study until 2 a.m., reading and rereading that prenuptial agreement, making notes, cross-referencing with our current financial situation. When Richard came to bed, I pretended to be asleep. "How was your late meeting?" I asked casually the next morning. "Oh, he said, not meeting my eyes. "Tedious contract negotiations. These European suppliers are very demanding." I nodded sympathetically. "That sounds exhausting." "I'm so glad you have Jessica to help with the complex architectural aspects." Richard's coffee mug paused halfway to his lips. "Jessica?" "The architect you mentioned. Jessica Miller? You said she has innovative ideas about sustainable design." "Oh, right. Yes, she's very professional." Professional. That was one way to put it. Ladies, let me tell you something I learned during those awful weeks in April and May. Once you know your partner is lying to you, you start hearing the lies in everything they say. Every explanation sounds hollow. Every excuse sounds rehearsed. Every expression of affection feels calculated. It's a terrible way to live, but it's also clarifying. I knew I had 3 choices. Option 1. Confront Richard immediately. Demand he end the affair. Try to rebuild our marriage through counseling and communication. Option 2. Pretend I didn't know. Hope the affair would burn itself out and Richard would come to his senses before doing permanent damage to our family. Option 3. Prepare for war. Maybe it was my financial training. Maybe it was 30 years of watching Richard make impulsive decisions and then rely on me to clean up the consequences. Maybe it was just pure, rational fury. I chose option 3. If Richard wanted to play games with our marriage, our finances, and our family's future, I was going to make sure I won. Once I knew about Jessica, everything changed. Not just emotionally, though my heart was breaking, but practically. I shifted into what I can only describe as professional mode. The same methodical, analytical mindset I used when auditing corporate accounts was now focused on my own marriage. And ladies, let me tell you something. When a woman with 25 years of financial forensics experience decides to investigate her cheating husband, that man doesn't stand a chance. First, I needed to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. The text messages told me about the affair, but they didn't tell me about the money. And in my experience, when someone is lying about one thing, they're usually lying about several things. I started with what I had access to, our joint accounts. Every morning, before Richard woke up, I'd review the previous day's transactions. Not just the credit card charges I'd been noticing, but everything. Bank transfers, cash withdrawals, automatic payments. I created a spreadsheet. Old habits die hard, tracking every expenditure that seemed out of pattern. What I discovered was systematic financial deception. For over a year, Richard had been making small but consistent transfers from our joint savings account to a personal account I didn't know existed. Never huge amounts. $500 here, $800 there. But they added up. By my calculations, he'd moved over $35,000 of our shared money into this secret account. Our shared money that was supposed to be for Sarah's remaining college expenses, for home maintenance, for our retirement. But the transfers were just the beginning. I started paying attention to Richard's business account deposits. As the spouse, I had legal access to statements, though I'd never looked at them closely before. I trusted Richard to manage his business finances appropriately. That trust had been misplaced. His sustainable materials import business was essentially fictional. Yes, he had a legitimate business license. Yes, he filed taxes and kept basic records. But the actual revenue was minimal, maybe $15,000 in profit over the entire previous year. So where was the money coming from for all those expensive dinners and gifts? He was liquidating our investments. Over 18 months, Richard had cashed out nearly $60,000 from our retirement accounts, paying early withdrawal penalties and taxes that would cost us tens of thousands more. Money we'd spent decades accumulating. Money that was supposed to fund our golden years was being spent on wooing a woman young enough to be our daughter. I felt sick. Not just emotionally sick, but physically sick. This man I'd trusted with our financial future was systematically destroying it to fund his midlife crisis. But I didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, I got smarter about gathering evidence. I opened my own checking account at a different bank, something I should have done decades ago, as my mother had advised. I started directing my Morrison and Associates paychecks there instead of our joint account. Richard was so distracted by his affair that he didn't even notice. Then I contacted Patricia Wells, the best family law attorney in Portland. I need to understand my options, I told her during our initial consultation. Hypothetically, Patricia was in her 50s, sharp-eyed and direct. She'd built her career representing women in high-asset divorces, and she had a reputation for being both thorough and ruthless. Hypothetically, she said with a slight smile, "You should bring me any prenuptial agreements, financial statements, and documentation of asset dissipation." I brought her everything. Patricia spent an hour reviewing our prenuptial agreement while I sat in her downtown office, watching boats move along the Willamette River through her floor-to-ceiling windows. "This is very well written," she finally said. "Ironically, it protects you far more than it protects him." She explained that the infidelity clause I'd found was indeed enforceable in Oregon. More importantly, Richard's systematic transfer of marital assets to fund his affair constituted dissipation, basically stealing from the marriage to benefit his extramarital relationship. "Even without the prenup, this kind of financial deception would work heavily in your favor," Patricia said. "With the prenup, assuming we can prove infidelity, your husband would be looking at losing about 80% of marital assets. And how do we prove infidelity? Photos, communications, witness testimony, credit card records, showing hotel charges or romantic dinners. The more documentation, the stronger the case. I had photos from Richard's phone. I had credit card records. But I needed more. That's when I made a decision that still makes me uncomfortable, but which I don't regret. I hired a private investigator. Her name was Carmen Rodriguez, a former police detective who specialized in matrimonial cases. She was recommended by Patricia and came with stellar reviews for discretion and thoroughness. "I don't want to destroy my husband," I told Carmen during our first meeting. "I just want to protect myself." Carmen nodded. She'd heard this before. "The truth is what it is. I just document it." What Carmen documented over the next month was breathtaking in its scope. Richard and Jessica weren't just having a casual affair. They were building a life together. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Richard would leave work early and meet Jessica at her apartment in the Pearl District. He'd told me he was joining a networking group for sustainable business owners that met twice weekly. Every Saturday morning, when he claimed to be at the gym for extended workouts, he was actually having brunch with Jessica at various Portland restaurants. Expensive restaurants. Restaurants where the average meal cost more than I spent on groceries in a week. They'd taken 3 weekend trips together over the past 6 months. Richard had told me these were business trips to meet with suppliers. Instead, he and Jessica had gone to the coast, to wine country, to Seattle. Carmen had photos of them checking into boutique hotels, walking hand in hand through Pike Place Market, kissing on the beach at Cannon Beach. All of this paid for with money from our retirement accounts. But the most damaging discovery was their future planning. Carmen captured them meeting with a real estate agent in Newport, looking at beachfront properties. She recorded them discussing financing options, touring houses that cost upward of $800,000. Richard was planning to buy a house with Jessica, using money he'd stolen from our marriage. The investigator's report was 47 pages long, with photographs, credit card records, and even audio recordings from their real estate meetings. Oregon is a one-party consent state. which meant Carmen could legally record conversations as long as one person, herself, posing as another potential buyer, consented to the recording. In those recordings, Richard and Jessica talked openly about their timeline. After Sarah graduates in June, Richard said, "I'll tell Margaret I want a separation. We'll sell the Portland house, split everything 50-50, and I'll have enough for a down payment on this place." "What if she fights it?" Jessica asked. "She won't," Richard replied with casual confidence. "Margaret's not confrontational. She'll be hurt, but she'll be practical about it. That's just who she is." Sitting in my car outside Carmen's office, listening to my husband discuss my personality with his mistress while planning to steal half of everything I'd worked for, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Pure, cold rage. Not the hot anger of a moment, but the calculating fury of someone who has been underestimated and betrayed by the person who should have protected them. Richard thought I wasn't confrontational. He was about to learn exactly how confrontational Margaret Thompson could be when someone threatened her financial security and her daughter's future. I spent the next month preparing for what Patricia called financial nuclear war. First, I secured our assets. I couldn't prevent Richard from accessing joint accounts without alerting him to my investigation, but I could protect what I could legally protect. I opened new investment accounts in my name only, and began systematically moving money that was clearly mine. Bonuses from Morrison, returns from investments I'd made before our marriage. Second, I gathered every piece of financial documentation I could find, bank statements going back 5 years, investment records, business documents, our wills, insurance policies, tax returns. Patricia's team would need everything to build an airtight case. Third, I prepared for life after Richard. This was the part that scared me most. I was 55 years old. I'd been married for 31 years. I'd never lived alone as an adult. I'd never made major decisions without consulting a husband. But I also had skills. I had experience. I had a reputation in Portland's financial community. I started quietly reaching out to former colleagues, letting them know I was considering leaving Morrison to start my own practice. The response was overwhelmingly positive. "It's about time, Margaret," said Linda Hoffman, my former supervisor who'd left Morrison 5 years earlier to start her own firm. "You've been ready for this for 20 years. I began researching office space, business licenses, insurance requirements. I created business plans and financial projections. If Richard was going to blow up our life, I was going to land on my feet, but I still hadn't decided when or how to confront him. That decision was made for me in early May. I was working late at Morrison when my phone rang. It was Sarah calling from her apartment in Corvallis. "Mom," she said, her voice shaking. "I need to tell you something, and I don't know how." My heart stopped. Had something happened to her? Was she hurt? In trouble? "What is it, sweetheart?" "I saw Dad today. In Corvallis. He was with a woman." Sarah had been studying for finals at a coffee shop near campus when Richard and Jessica walked in. She ducked behind a bookshelf, not wanting to interrupt what looked like a business meeting. "But Mom, they weren't talking about business. They were holding hands. And when they left, he kissed her. Right there, in public." My daughter had discovered her father's affair on her own. "I didn't know what to do," Sarah continued, crying now. "I didn't know if I should tell you. I didn't know if you already knew. I've been sick about it for 3 days." This was the moment I realized that my decision to wait until after Sarah's graduation to deal with Richard's betrayal had been wrong. My daughter was already being hurt by her father's lies. She was carrying the burden of his secret, feeling guilty about knowledge she never should have had to bear. "Sarah," I said, as calmly as I could manage, "I know about your father and Jessica. I've known for a while. You do? But why haven't you? What are you going to do? I'm going to handle it. But not until after your graduation. This is your time, your achievement. Don't let Dad's poor choices overshadow that. Mom, I'm so sorry. You have nothing to be sorry for, sweetheart. Nothing about this is your fault. After we hung up, I sat in my empty office and made my final decision. Richard wanted to make his big announcement after Sarah's graduation? Fine. But I was going to be ready for him. I called Patricia Wells. I want to file the divorce papers now, I said. But I want them sealed until I'm ready to serve them. When will that be? I thought about Richard's plan to humiliate me publicly, to announce our divorce at Sarah's celebration dinner, to count on my being too shocked and hurt to respond effectively. At Sarah's graduation dinner, I said, I'm going to give him exactly what he's planning to give me, just with better preparation. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Margaret, are you sure you want to do this publicly? Divorce can be handled quietly, privately. He's not planning to handle it quietly. And frankly, Patricia, I'm tired of protecting the feelings of a man who has spent months systematically lying to me while stealing our retirement money to fund his affair. In that case, Patricia said, and I could hear the smile in her voice, let's make sure you're fully prepared. Over the next 3 weeks, I became a woman with a secret mission. I finalized the business plan for Thompson Financial Consulting. I secured a small office space downtown. I ordered business cards and stationery. I opened bank accounts for the new business and transferred my Morrison retirement account into a self-directed IRA that Richard couldn't touch. I bought a new dress for Sarah's graduation dinner. Navy blue, elegant, the kind of outfit that would photograph well. Because I had a feeling this dinner was going to be memorable. Most importantly, I prepared the envelope. Inside were copies of the divorce papers. Filed but sealed, copies of the investigator's report, including photos of Richard and Jessica's romantic getaways, copies of the financial records showing his systematic theft of our retirement money, and a highlighted copy of our prenuptial agreement with the infidelity clause marked in bright yellow. Richard thought he was going to ambush me. He had no idea I'd been preparing for battle. The morning of Sarah's graduation, I woke up at 5:30 a.m. feeling more clear-headed than I had in months. Richard was still sleeping, probably exhausted from whatever late-night texting session he'd had with Jessica the night before. I made coffee and sat on our back porch, looking at the garden we'd planted together 15 years ago. The roses were in full bloom. The David Austin varieties Richard had insisted on because they were more sophisticated than regular roses. Everything in our life had to be elevated, refined, special. Even our flowers. In a few hours, our marriage would be over. Not legally, that would take months to finalize, but emotionally, practically, publicly, over. I should have felt sad. Instead, I felt relief. At 7 a.m., Richard shuffled into the kitchen in his robe, hair disheveled, looking older than his 57 years. The stress of maintaining his double life was showing. Big day, he said, not meeting my eyes as he poured coffee. Yes, I agreed. Very big day. If he caught the edge in my voice, he didn't show it. He was probably too busy rehearsing his speech, planning his grand moment of liberation. I'm picking up my dress from the dry cleaner this morning, I said conversationally. The navy one with the fitted waist. I want to look special for Sarah's celebration. That's nice, Richard mumbled, scrolling through his phone. Probably checking messages from Jessica. I watched him for a moment. This man I'd lived with for 3 decades, who I'd supported through career changes and family crises, who I'd built a life with brick by brick. In just a few hours, he was planning to destroy all of it in the most public, humiliating way possible. But he'd made one crucial miscalculation. He thought I was weak. At 9 a.m., I drove to Patricia Wells's office to collect my envelope. She handed it to me with a serious expression. "Are you absolutely certain you want to do this publicly, Margaret? Once you hand him this envelope in front of your family and friends, there's no going back." "Patricia, my husband is planning to announce our divorce at our daughter's graduation dinner. He's counted on me being too shocked and devastated to respond." "But I'm not shocked, and I'm not devastated. I'm prepared." She nodded. "In that case, I'll be on standby tonight. I expect his attorney will be calling me first thing Monday morning." The graduation ceremony at Oregon State was beautiful. Sarah looked radiant in her cap and gown, graduating summa cum laude with a degree in marketing and a job already lined up in Seattle. She'd accomplished everything through her own hard work and determination. Richard played the proud father perfectly, taking photos and beaming with genuine pride. For a moment, watching him hug Sarah after the ceremony, I almost felt sad about what was coming. Almost. But then, I saw him check his phone and smile at whatever message he'd received. Probably Jessica, wishing him luck with his big announcement. We had 2 hours between the ceremony and dinner. Richard said he needed to handle some business calls and disappeared into his study. I used the time to get ready, taking extra care with my appearance. The navy dress fit perfectly. My hair, styled that morning at my usual salon, looked elegant but not overdone. I wore the pearl earrings Richard had given me for our 20th anniversary, back when he still bought gifts for me instead of his mistress. I looked like a woman who had her life together, which, for the first time in months, I actually did. At 5:30, we drove to the Riverside View in Richard's BMW. He seemed nervous, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel and making small talk about the weather. "Beautiful evening for a celebration," he said. "Yes," I replied, touching the envelope in my purse. "Perfect evening for surprises." The restaurant was as elegant as I remembered. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Columbia River, and our private dining room accommodated all 60 guests perfectly. Sarah had invited friends from college. Richard's business colleagues were there, my former coworkers from Morrison, both our families. And at a table in the back, looking nervous but trying to blend in, sat Jessica Miller. I'd insisted she be invited, telling Richard it would be rude to exclude his business associate from such an important family celebration. He'd been trapped. Objecting would have raised questions he wasn't prepared to answer. Now she sat there in a black cocktail dress, 35 years old, and beautiful, watching the man she was sleeping with play devoted family man one last time. Dinner was served at 6:30. The salmon was perfect, the wine excellent, the conversation flowing easily. Sarah glowed with happiness, talking about her new job and her excitement about moving to Seattle. Richard checked his watch frequently. He'd obviously planned his announcement for a specific time, probably during the traditional toast, when he'd have everyone's attention. At 7:45, he stood up, champagne glass in hand. "If I could have everyone's attention," he said, his voice carrying across the room. The conversations died down. 60 pairs of eyes turned toward him expectantly. Sarah beamed, thinking her father was about to make a loving toast to her achievements. Instead, Richard took a deep breath and delivered the line he'd been rehearsing. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate Sarah's graduation. But I also need to share something important with all of you. I've decided to start a new life without Margaret." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's face crumpled. The champagne glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor. Carol, Richard's sister, let out an audible gasp. My former colleague Linda reached over and gripped my arm. Jessica shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly not expecting the announcement to be quite so brutal. Everyone looked at me, waiting for the reaction Richard had scripted in his head. Tears, shock, a dramatic breakdown that would let him play the role of the reluctant husband forced to end an unhappy marriage. Instead, I smiled. Congratulations on your honesty, Richard. I reached into my purse and pulled out the cream-colored envelope. With steady hands, I placed it next to his untouched salmon. "What's this?" he asked, his triumphant expression faltering. "Something for you to read later." I stood up, kissed Sarah's tear-stained cheek, and addressed our stunned guests. "Please enjoy your meal. I wish you all a lovely evening." Then I walked out of that restaurant with my head held high, feeling 60 pairs of eyes following me but no longer caring what any of them thought. Outside, the June air felt like freedom. I was halfway to my car when I heard the restaurant door slam and footsteps running after me. "Margaret!" Richard's voice was no longer confident. It was high-pitched, frantic, desperate. "What the hell is this? What have you done?" I kept walking, allowing myself a small smile. Behind me, I could hear him tearing open the envelope. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, then louder. "Margaret! We need to talk about this." I turned around. Richard stood under the restaurant's elegant awning, divorce papers scattered at his feet, his face white as the envelope they'd come in. "There's nothing to talk about, Richard. You wanted honesty? That's my honesty." "You can't do this. Not like this. Not tonight." "I didn't choose tonight. You did. You chose to make our private business public. I'm just responding in kind." A few guests had followed us outside, drawn by Richard's shouting. Carol was there, looking mortified. Sarah stood in the doorway, still crying but watching the scene with growing understanding. "You've been planning this," Richard accused. "How long have you been planning this?" "Long enough. The prenup expired years ago. Any lawyer will tell you that." Section 15, paragraph 3, I said calmly. "Maybe you should have read it more carefully before you started stealing our retirement money to buy jewelry for your girlfriend." At the word girlfriend, several guests turned to look at Jessica, who was still visible through the restaurant windows, sitting alone at her table like a deer caught in headlights. "You recorded my conversations! That's illegal!" "Actually, it's not. Oregon is a one-party consent state, and those conversations took place in our home. I consented to recording them." Richard's panic was escalating. The plan he'd spent months crafting was unraveling in real time, in front of everyone who mattered to him professionally and personally. "Margaret, please, can't we discuss this privately? Like adults? The time for private discussion was 6 months ago, when you first started lying to me. Or 3 months ago, when you started stealing our money. Or last week, when you could have told me about Jessica honestly instead of planning this public humiliation. You don't understand? I understand perfectly. You've been systematically moving our assets to fund your affair. You've been planning to divorce me and steal half of everything I've worked for. You thought announcing it publicly would prevent me from fighting back effectively." Sarah had moved closer, listening to every word. Her tears had stopped, replaced by something harder. "Dad," she said quietly, "is this true? About the girlfriend?" Richard looked at his daughter, his brilliant, accomplished daughter, whose graduation dinner he'd just destroyed, and for a moment, his facade cracked completely. "Sarah, it's complicated." "It's not complicated," I interrupted. "Your father has been having an affair with Jessica Miller for over a year. He's been using our retirement money to fund romantic getaways and buy her gifts. He was planning to leave me after your graduation so he could start a new life with her." The small crowd that had gathered was silent, processing this information. Richard's business colleagues, people he'd worked with for years, were seeing him revealed as a liar and a cheat. "You're destroying me," he said, his voice breaking. No, Richard, you destroyed yourself. I'm just refusing to let you destroy me too. My phone buzzed. A text from Patricia Wells. Just saw your husband trying to call his lawyer. Mine isn't answering either. It's Saturday night. Preliminary hearing is scheduled for Tuesday at 9 a.m. I looked at Richard one more time. This man who'd shared my bed for 31 years, who'd held my hand through miscarriages and family deaths, who I'd loved with everything I had. You have until Sunday evening to remove your personal belongings from the house, I said. After that, the locks will be changed. Margaret, wait. But I was already walking away, heading toward my car and my new life. Behind me, I could hear Richard trying to explain himself to the small crowd of family and friends, trying to salvage his reputation, his relationships, his dignity. It was too late for all of that. As I drove home through the quiet Portland streets, I thought about the woman I'd been that morning, still playing the role of supportive wife, still protecting a man who'd been planning to humiliate me. That woman was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who'd finally learned that being kind doesn't mean being weak, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's destructive choices. When I got home, I poured myself a glass of the good wine, the bottle Richard and I had been saving for a special occasion, and sat in my study with my laptop. I had a business to launch, a life to rebuild, and a future to create. But first, I called Sarah. Mom, she answered immediately. Are you okay? I'm better than okay, sweetheart. I'm free. Dad's still at the restaurant, trying to convince everyone that this is all some big misunderstanding. Nobody's buying it. I'm sorry, your graduation dinner was ruined. It wasn't ruined, Sarah said firmly. It was the night I realized my mother is the strongest woman I know. 20 minutes later, I heard Richard's car in the driveway. The reckoning was just beginning. Richard's BMW pulled into our driveway at 9:47 p.m. I know the exact time because I was sitting in my study, reviewing documents by lamplight, when I heard the engine cut off. He sat in the car for almost 10 minutes before coming inside. I could see him through the window, probably trying to gather his thoughts, maybe calling Jessica to explain why his perfect plan had imploded so spectacularly. When he finally came through the front door, he wasn't the confident man who'd stood up at dinner expecting to deliver a knockout punch. He looked haggard, defeated, like someone who'd just realized they'd miscalculated everything. Margaret? He called out. We need to talk. I'm in the study, I replied calmly. He appeared in the doorway, still wearing his dress shirt and slacks from dinner, but his tie was gone and his hair was disheveled. He looked like a man who'd been running his hands through it for hours. What you did tonight was cruel, he said without preamble. I looked up from my laptop, where I'd been reviewing the business license application for Thompson Financial Consulting. Cruel? You announced our divorce at our daughter's graduation dinner, in front of 60 people, after planning it for months. But somehow my response was cruel? You humiliated me in front of everyone I know. I handed you an envelope, Richard. You humiliated yourself. He slumped into the chair across from my desk, the same chair where he'd sat countless times over the years when we'd discussed family finances, Sarah's college plans, our retirement dreams. The prenup, he said quietly. You said it's still valid. Section 15 is very clear about the duration, for the term of the marriage, plus any legal proceedings resulting from its dissolution. There's no expiration date. But it's been 31 years, and you insisted on every word of it, specifically the infidelity clause. You were very concerned about protecting your assets if I ever cheated on you. Richard was quiet for a long moment, probably remembering those discussions in 1991 when his lawyer had drafted the agreement. He'd been so worried about gold diggers, so concerned about protecting his inheritance. How long have you known? He asked. About Jessica? Since April. About your financial deception? Since December. His face went white. December? You've known since December and never said anything? I've been documenting everything, Richard. Building a case. Because unlike you, I don't make impulsive decisions that destroy people's lives. I plan carefully. Jesus Christ, Margaret. You've been spying on me for 6 months? I've been protecting myself for 6 months. There's a difference. He stood up abruptly and began pacing the small study, a habit he'd had since college when he was stressed. This is insane. We can work this out. People go through rough patches. Marriages can be saved. Can they? When one partner systematically steals retirement money to fund an affair, when they plan to announce a divorce publicly to humiliate their spouse, when they make plans to buy houses with their mistress using marital assets? Richard stopped pacing. How do you know about Newport? I know about all of it, Richard. The weekend trips you took while lying about business meetings. The romantic dinners charged to our credit cards. The secret apartment Jessica thinks you can afford. I know you've been planning your escape for over a year. You hired someone, a private investigator. I hired professionals to document what you are hiding. Yes, that's invasion of privacy. I almost laughed. You're lecturing me about privacy? You've been lying to me every single day for months. You've been stealing our money, cheating on our marriage, and planning to leave me in the most humiliating way possible. But hiring someone to document your lies is invasion of privacy? Richard sat back down heavily. What do you want? I want you to understand something very clearly. This divorce is happening. It was happening the moment you decided to cheat. The only question now is whether it happens amicably or whether it gets very, very ugly. What does that mean? I pulled out a folder from my desk drawer and opened it in front of him. Bank statements, credit card records, photographs from the private investigator, screenshots of text messages. It means that you've given me enough evidence to destroy you financially and professionally. The prenup entitles me to 80% of our marital assets when you're proven to be the cheating party. That includes this house, our retirement accounts, and your business interests. Richard flipped through the documents, his face growing paler with each page. You can't take my business. I built that myself. With marital assets, using our joint credit cards to fund operations, working from a home office in a house we own together. Your business is marital property, Richard. This is vindictive. This is justice. You made choices, and choices have consequences. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it and grimaced. Jessica's asking what happened. She's confused about why I'm not. Why we're not celebrating. I imagine she is confused. Did you tell her about the prenup? About what would happen if your affair was discovered? Richard's silence was answer enough. So Jessica thinks she's about to start a new life, with a man who's about to receive half of a substantial marital estate. She doesn't know that her boyfriend is about to be nearly broke? It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. You've been lying to her too, Richard. Promising her a lifestyle you can't deliver, making plans with money you won't have access to. My phone rang. Patricia Wells, even though it was nearly 10 p.m. on a Saturday. Excuse me, I told Richard and answered. Margaret, I just received a very interesting phone call from James Morrison. James Morrison was one of Portland's most expensive divorce attorneys. Also one of the least ethical. Let me guess, I said. He's been retained by my husband. He wants to meet Monday morning to discuss resolving this matter quickly and quietly. He also mentioned something about your evidence being obtained illegally. Everything was obtained legally. Richard left his phone unlocked in our shared kitchen. The private investigator worked entirely within Oregon law. The financial records are for accounts I have legal access to as a spouse. That's what I told him. I also mentioned that we have audio recordings of Mr. Thompson and his girlfriend discussing real estate purchases with marital assets made in a public setting where there was no expectation of privacy. Richard could hear Patricia's voice through the phone. His face went even whiter. Morrison also suggested that your husband might be willing to negotiate a more equitable division of assets in exchange for discretion about the affair. What did you tell him? I told him that discretion was off the table the moment his client decided to announce the divorce publicly. I also mentioned that any attempt to hide assets or transfer funds would result in contempt of court charges. After I hung up, Richard stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. You've really thought of everything, haven't you? I've spent 31 years being married to a man who makes impulsive decisions and expects other people to clean up the mess. I learned to be thorough. So what happens now? Now you call Jessica and explain that your plan has hit some complications. You pack your personal belongings and move out by tomorrow night. And Monday morning, we begin the legal process of ending our marriage. Where am I supposed to go? That's not my problem anymore, Richard. But I believe your sister Carol offered you her guest room. He was quiet for several minutes, processing the complete destruction of everything he'd planned. I made a mistake, he said finally. A terrible mistake. But 31 years should count for something. I looked at this man I'd once loved more than my own life. The man I'd supported through career changes and family crises. The man who'd held my hand through miscarriages and celebrated with me when Sarah was born. 31 years counted for everything to me, I said quietly. That's why your betrayal hurt so deeply. But you threw those years away the moment you decided Jessica was worth more than our marriage. I never meant for it to happen. It just developed. No, Richard. Feelings might have developed, but everything else was a choice. You chose to pursue her. You chose to lie to me. You chose to steal our money. You chose to plan your exit strategy. You chose to humiliate me publicly. Every single step was a deliberate choice. Richard's phone buzzed again. This time he answered. Jessica? No, I can't come over tonight. It's complicated. Pause. What do you mean? What kind of complications? I could hear Jessica's voice through the phone, high-pitched and demanding answers. Just trust me. I'll explain everything tomorrow. Another pause. No, you can't come here. He hung up and looked at me with something approaching desperation. She's going to find out that I can't afford the Newport house, or the apartment we looked at, or any of the things I promised her. Yes, she is. She'll leave me. Probably. Margaret, please. Isn't there some way we can work this out? Some way to avoid all of this? For just a moment, I felt sorry for him. This man, who'd thrown away 3 decades of marriage for a fantasy he couldn't afford, who was about to lose everything he'd worked for, who was finally realizing that his grand romantic gesture was actually a catastrophic miscalculation. But then I thought about Sarah's face at dinner when her father destroyed her graduation celebration. I thought about the months I'd spent questioning my own sanity while he lied to my face. I thought about our retirement money being spent on romantic getaways with a woman young enough to be our daughter. The way to work this out was 6 months ago, when you could have come to me honestly about your feelings. Or 3 months ago, when you could have suggested marriage counseling. Or last week, when you could have asked for a separation with dignity instead of planning a public humiliation. But not now. Now, it's too late. You made your choice, Richard. You chose Jessica over me, secrets over honesty, selfishness over family. Now you get to live with those choices. At 11:30 p.m., Richard finally went upstairs to pack. I could hear him moving around in our bedroom, opening and closing drawers, probably calling Jessica to explain why their celebration dinner had turned into a disaster. I stayed in my study, working on the final details of Thompson Financial Consulting's business plan. Tomorrow, I'd start the process of launching my own company. Monday, I'd begin the legal battle to protect my financial future. By Tuesday, I'd know whether Richard planned to fight the divorce or accept the inevitable. But tonight, for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. At midnight, Richard appeared in my study doorway with 2 suitcases. "I'm going to Carol's," he said. "We'll need to talk more about practical things. Sarah's college bills, the mortgage, day-to-day stuff. Patricia will handle all communication going forward. Don't contact me directly unless it's an emergency involving Sarah. Margaret." "What?" "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am sorry." I looked at him standing there with his suitcases, finally being honest after months of lies. Too little, too late. "I know you are, Richard, but sorry doesn't give me back the retirement money you spent on her. Sorry doesn't undo the public humiliation you planned. Sorry doesn't rebuild the trust you destroyed." He nodded and turned to leave, then stopped. "Will you tell Sarah?" "I'll tell Sarah the truth. That her father made choices that ended our marriage, and that sometimes people we love disappoint us, but life goes on." After the front door closed behind him, I sat in the quiet house we'd shared for 23 years and felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Pure, overwhelming relief. The marriage was over, but the war was just beginning. Monday morning, 6:43 a.m. I was drinking coffee in my quiet kitchen when Patricia Wells called. "Margaret, we have a problem. Richard's attorney filed an emergency motion to freeze all marital assets. He's claiming you've been hiding money and planning to dissipate assets." I nearly choked on my coffee. "He's claiming I'm hiding money? That's rich." It gets better. James Morrison is also arguing that your evidence was obtained through illegal surveillance and should be thrown out. They're requesting an emergency hearing for this afternoon. Can they do that? They can try, but Margaret, they just made a fatal tactical error. By filing these motions, they've opened the door for us to present all of our evidence immediately, including the audio recordings and financial documentation. They're essentially asking the judge to review everything we have on Richard. Patricia's voice had the satisfied tone of a lawyer whose opponent had just walked into a trap. "What do you need me to do?" "Be at the courthouse at 2 p.m. Wear something conservative and bring copies of everything. The prenup, the financial records, all of it. This hearing is going to determine how the rest of this divorce proceeds." I spent the morning organizing documents and making phone calls to set up my new business. By noon, I felt as prepared as possible for whatever James Morrison was planning to throw at me. At 1:45 p.m., I walked into Multnomah County Courthouse, wearing my best Navy suit and carrying a briefcase full of evidence. Patricia was waiting for me in the hallway, looking like a woman who was about to enjoy herself immensely. "How confident are you?" I asked. "Let's just say that in 25 years of practice, I've never seen someone hand me a better case. Your husband's attorney is either incompetent or desperate, possibly both." At exactly 2 p.m., we entered Judge Barbara Chen's courtroom. Judge Chen was in her early 60s, with sharp eyes and a reputation for having no patience with dishonest litigants. Richard sat at the plaintiff's table with James Morrison, a silver-haired man in an expensive suit who'd built his career representing wealthy men in ugly divorces. Richard looked terrible, pale, exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days. Which he probably hadn't. "Your Honor," Morrison began as soon as we were seated, "my client is requesting emergency relief from what can only be described as A vindictive and calculated attack on his character and finances. Mrs. Thompson has engaged in illegal surveillance, hired private investigators to stalk my client, and has been secretly moving marital assets in preparation for this divorce. Judge Chen looked at Patricia. How does your client respond to these allegations? Patricia stood up with a smile. Your Honor, we welcome the opportunity to address these claims, particularly since they open the door to presenting evidence of Mr. Thompson's systematic financial deception and extramarital affair. Morrison's confident expression faltered slightly. Furthermore, Patricia continued, we have documentation showing that Mr. Thompson has been the one moving marital assets, specifically liquidating retirement accounts to fund his affair and transferring money to personal accounts his wife had no knowledge of. Mr. Morrison, Judge Chen said, you're claiming Mrs. Thompson illegally obtained evidence of her husband's affair? Yes, Your Honor. She hired private investigators to follow my client, recorded private conversations, and accessed his personal communications without consent. Patricia opened her briefcase. Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence that every piece of documentation we possess was obtained legally. The private investigator worked entirely in public spaces where there was no expectation of privacy. The recorded conversations took place in the marital home with Mrs. Thompson's consent, which is legal under Oregon's one-party consent law, and the financial records are for accounts Mrs. Thompson has legal access to as a spouse. Judge Chen reviewed the documents Patricia handed her. The silence in the courtroom stretched on for several minutes. Mr. Morrison, the judge finally said, are you familiar with the prenuptial agreement your client signed in 1991? Yes, Your Honor, but we believe that agreement is no longer valid after 31 years. Section 15 clearly states that the agreement remains in effect for the duration of the marriage plus any legal proceedings. There is no expiration date. Judge Chen's voice was getting sharper. Are you also familiar with the infidelity clause in Section 18? Morrison shuffled his papers nervously. Your Honor, we dispute whether the alleged infidelity can be proven. Mrs. Wells, what evidence do you have of infidelity? Patricia smiled. Photographs of Mr. Thompson and Miss Jessica Miller in romantic situations at multiple locations. Credit card records showing charges for romantic dinners in hotel rooms. Text messages between Mr. Thompson and Miss Miller discussing their relationship and plans for the future. And audio recordings of Mr. Thompson and Miss Miller touring real estate properties together while discussing their plans to live together after his divorce. She handed the judge a thick folder. All obtained legally, Your Honor. Judge Chen spent 10 minutes reviewing the evidence while the courtroom remained silent. Richard slumped lower in his chair with each page she turned. Finally, the judge looked up. Mr. Morrison, your client has been systematically liquidating marital assets to fund an extramarital relationship in direct violation of his prenuptial agreement. The evidence is overwhelming and properly obtained. Your emergency motion is denied. Morrison stood up desperately. Your Honor, if we could just have more time to review. Furthermore, Judge Chen continued, I am ordering an immediate freeze on all of Mr. Thompson's personal accounts pending a full financial audit. Mrs. Thompson's request for exclusive use of the marital home is granted. This court will reconvene in 2 weeks for a full hearing on asset division. Richard looked like he'd been hit by a truck. As we left the courthouse, Patricia was practically glowing. Margaret, in 25 years of family law, I have never seen someone destroy their own case so completely. Richard's attorney just handed us everything we needed to enforce that prenup to the letter. What happens now? Now we wait for the inevitable phone calls. Jessica Miller is about to discover that her boyfriend is broke, and Richard is about to realize that his romantic fantasy is over. I didn't have to wait long. At 4:30 p.m., I was in my new office space. a small but elegant suite downtown that would house Thompson Financial Consulting, when my phone rang. "Margaret? It's Carol." Richard's sister sounded exhausted. "How are you holding up, Carol?" "Honestly, I'm furious with my brother. But I'm calling because Richard is falling apart, and I thought you should know." "What do you mean?" "Jessica found out about the court hearing, about the money situation. She came to my house an hour ago, screaming at Richard in my front yard. Half my neighbors came out to watch the show. I almost felt sorry for Richard. Almost." "What happened?" "She called him a liar and a fraud. Said he'd promised her a lifestyle he couldn't deliver. Apparently, she'd already given notice at her job and put a deposit down on some expensive apartment, thinking Richard was about to come into a lot of money from the divorce. And now? Now she's gone. Left her key to Richard's car on my driveway and drove off in her own car. Richard's been sitting in my guest room for 2 hours, staring at the wall." Carol was quiet for a moment. "Margaret, I know what my brother did was unforgivable, but he's my brother and I hate seeing him like this." "I understand, Carol. But Richard made his choices. All of them." "I know. I wanted you to know that Jessica's out of the picture, in case that changes anything." It didn't change anything. Richard hadn't betrayed our marriage for Jessica specifically. He'd betrayed it for the idea of Jessica. For youth, excitement, a chance to feel like someone other than a middle-aged man with an ordinary life. Even without Jessica, he was still the man who'd lied to me for months, stolen our retirement money, and planned to humiliate me publicly. But that evening brought more interesting news. At 7 p.m., Patricia called again. "I just heard from James Morrison. Richard wants to negotiate a settlement." "What kind of settlement?" "He's willing to accept the prenup terms, 80% of assets to you, in exchange for keeping the affair details private and avoiding a public trial." I thought about this for exactly 3 seconds. "Number." "Margaret, this would give you everything you're entitled to without the stress and expense of a trial." "Patricia, Richard chose to make our divorce public when he announced it at Sarah's graduation dinner. He can't unchoose that now. Besides, I want this on the record. I want it documented legally that Richard Thompson is a cheating, lying thief who destroyed his family for a fantasy." "Any particular reason you want it on the record?" "Because I'm starting a financial consulting business that will serve women going through major life transitions. My divorce case will establish my credibility and show potential clients that I practice what I preach about protecting yourself financially." Patricia laughed. "You're turning your divorce into a marketing opportunity?" "I'm turning my divorce into a cautionary tale with a happy ending." 2 days later, the story got even better. I was meeting with my first potential client, a woman whose husband had just left her for his secretary, when my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Mom, you need to see this. Check Jessica Miller's Instagram." I apologized to my client and quickly looked up Jessica's social media profile. The latest post was a photo of Jessica with a tall, silver-haired man in what appeared to be an expensive restaurant. The caption read, "New beginnings with someone who actually has his life together." Number, "No time." For whiners. Number, "Moving on." Number, "Blessed." The man in the photo looked familiar. I scrolled through the comments until I found one that made me laugh out loud. "Isn't that Robert Caldwell? The real estate developer?" someone had written. Robert Caldwell, one of Portland's wealthiest developers. A man who was actually rich, actually successful, actually available. Jessica had moved on from Richard in less than a week. I showed the post to my client, who was struggling with her own feelings of abandonment and betrayal. "Look," I said, "this woman spent over a year planning a future with my husband. She threw away her job security and made major life decisions based on his promises. But the moment she discovered he couldn't deliver the lifestyle he'd promised, she moved on to someone who could. My client stared at the photo. That fast? That fast. Which tells you everything you need to know about what Richard's affair was really about. It wasn't love. It wasn't destiny. It was opportunism. How does that make you feel? Vindicated, I said honestly. Richard threw away 31 years of marriage for a woman who didn't actually care about him. She cared about what she thought he could give her. Over the next week, the ripple effects of Richard's implosion continued. His business partner called to dissolve their sustainable materials import company. Apparently, Richard's public humiliation at Sarah's graduation dinner had reached their European suppliers, who were concerned about being associated with personal instability. 2 of Richard's longtime clients canceled their contracts after hearing about the affair and financial deception. In the small world of Portland architecture and development, reputation was everything. Even Richard's gym membership became a problem. The athletic club where he'd been working out with Jessica canceled his membership, citing disruption of club atmosphere after Richard had apparently shown up multiple times hoping to run into her. Meanwhile, Thompson Financial Consulting was gaining momentum. Word of my divorce case was spreading through Portland's professional women's network. Not the salacious details, but the essential story. A financial professional who'd protected herself from a cheating husband and was now helping other women do the same. I booked my first 3 clients within a week of opening. Linda Hoffman, my former supervisor at Morrison, referred 2 women who were going through their own divorces. Both had been married to men who'd hidden assets and made financial decisions without their wives' knowledge. Margaret Thompson knows exactly what you're going through, Linda told them, and she knows how to fight back. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, but on Monday afternoon, James Morrison called Patricia with a final offer. Richard will accept the full prenup terms, Morrison said. 80% of all marital assets to your client, including the house, retirement accounts, and business interests. In exchange, he wants the proceedings sealed and asks for minimal spousal support during the transition period. Patricia called me immediately. Margaret, this is as good as it gets. You'd receive everything you're entitled to under the prenup, plus the satisfaction of knowing Richard gets almost nothing. What about the public record? The basic facts would still be public, that the divorce was granted, that assets were divided according to a prenuptial agreement, but the details about the affair and financial deception would be sealed. I thought about Richard, probably sitting in Carol's guest room, finally understanding that his grand romantic gesture had cost him everything he'd worked for his entire adult life. I thought about Jessica, already posting happy photos with her new, actually wealthy boyfriend. I thought about Sarah, who was starting her new job in Seattle and deserved to move forward without her father's mistakes haunting her forever. And I thought about the women who would become my clients, who needed to see that it was possible to protect yourself from financial abuse and come out stronger on the other side. Accept the offer, I told Patricia, but I want it finalized this week. I have a business to build. Consider it done. That evening, I sat in my study in my house, planning my company's future, and opened a bottle of champagne. Not to celebrate the end of my marriage. That was still painful, still sad, still a loss that would take time to fully process. But to celebrate the beginning of something new, something that was entirely mine. Something that Richard's betrayal had forced me to create but could never take away. 6 months after that disastrous graduation dinner, I was sitting in my downtown office on a rainy November morning, reviewing financial portfolios for 3 new clients, when Sarah called from Seattle. Mom, have you seen the Portland Business Journal this week? No, sweetheart. I've been too busy to read anything but client files. Why? There's a feature article about you. Second act success. How one woman turned personal crisis into professional triumph. You're on page 12. I put Sarah on speaker and pulled up the Business Journal's website. There it was, a photo of me in my office, smiling confidently behind my desk, with the headline exactly as Sarah had read it. The article described Thompson Financial Consulting as Portland's fastest-growing financial planning firm specializing in women's life transitions. It mentioned that I'd left a senior position at Morrison & Associates to start my own practice, and that my client base had grown from 0 to 47 women in just 6 months. What it didn't mention, because I'd never discussed it publicly, was that my own divorce had been the catalyst for everything. "Mom, I'm so proud of you," Sarah said. "You've built something amazing." "Thank you, sweetheart. How are things going with your new job?" "Really well. I got promoted to Senior Marketing Coordinator last week. And Mom, I have some news." "Good news, I hope." "I think so. Dad called me yesterday. He wanted me to tell you that he's moving to Phoenix. He got a job with an architectural firm there, starting fresh." I felt a complicated mix of emotions hearing this. Relief that Richard was finally accepting reality and moving forward. Sadness that our family was truly geographically scattered now. And maybe a little satisfaction that his new life in Phoenix would be a far cry from the glamorous beachfront retirement he'd planned with Jessica. "How do you feel about that?" I asked Sarah. "Honestly, I think it's good for him. He needs to start over somewhere people don't know what happened, and maybe some distance will help him figure out who he actually is." My daughter, at 22, was wiser than many people twice her age. "Have you forgiven him?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. "I'm working on it. I don't think I'll ever understand why he chose to blow up our family the way he did. But he's still my father, and I don't want to carry anger around forever." After we hung up, I sat in my office thinking about forgiveness. Not just Sarah's forgiveness of Richard, but my own journey toward letting go of the anger that had sustained me through those terrible months. The truth was, I'd been so busy building my new life that I'd barely had time to process the end of my old one. Thompson Financial Consulting had exceeded every projection I'd made in my business plan. What had started as a necessity, I needed to earn money to support myself, had become a passion. Every day, I met with women who were facing the same fears I'd faced. How do you rebuild financial security after a major life upheaval? How do you protect yourself from someone you trusted? How do you plan for a future you never expected to have? My own experience had given me credibility that no MBA could provide. When I told clients about hidden asset searches, they believed me because I'd done it myself. When I explained the importance of separate accounts and independent credit, they listened because they could see I'd survived my own financial crisis. But success in business didn't automatically heal the emotional wounds of betrayal. That afternoon, I had lunch with Linda Hoffman, my former supervisor and now close friend. We met at a small cafe in the Pearl District, ironically just blocks from where Jessica had lived during her affair with Richard. "You look good, Margaret," Linda said as we sat down. "Really good. Like you're finally comfortable in your own skin." "I feel different," I admitted. "More myself, if that makes sense." "It makes perfect sense. You spent 30 years being half of a couple. Now you're discovering who Margaret is as a complete person." Linda had gone through her own divorce 15 years earlier, so she understood the strange combination of grief and liberation that comes with ending a long marriage. "Can I ask you something?" Linda said. "Do you ever regret how you handled it? The public confrontation at the restaurant?" I considered this. It was a question I'd asked myself many times over the past 6 months. "I regret that Sarah's graduation dinner was ruined," I said finally. "I regret that our extended family and friends had to witness something so ugly. But do I regret refusing to be humiliated quietly? Number. I don't regret that at all. Richard's plan was to shock you into submission. Make the announcement so publicly that you'd be too embarrassed to fight back effectively. Exactly. He counted on me being the good wife, who'd prioritize everyone else's comfort over her own protection. He forgot that the good wife had spent 25 years learning how to analyze financial statements and read legal contracts. Speaking of Richard, Linda said carefully, I heard something through the Morrison gossip network. Apparently, he had to declare bankruptcy before moving to Phoenix. The legal fees and settlement costs wiped out what little he had left after the prenup. I felt a pang of something. Not quite sympathy, but not satisfaction either. Just sadness that it had all come to this. Jessica's doing well, though, Linda continued. I saw an announcement in the society pages. She's engaged to that real estate developer. Big wedding planned for next spring at some resort in Hawaii. Good for her, I said, and surprised myself by meaning it. At least someone got their happy ending. That evening, I was working late in my office when Patricia Wells stopped by. She'd become not just my attorney, but a friend and informal mentor as I built my business. Working late again? She asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. Preparing for tomorrow's client meetings. Mrs. Henderson is going through a particularly nasty divorce, and her husband's attorney is trying to hide assets in offshore accounts. Sounds familiar, Patricia said, with a wry smile. Different scale, same tactics. Men who think they're smarter than their wives, until their wives hire professionals who actually know what they're doing. Patricia pulled out a bottle of wine and 2 glasses from her briefcase. I thought we should celebrate. What are we celebrating? The fact that you've built a successful business, helped dozens of women protect their financial futures, and turned your own painful experience into something that benefits others. That's worth celebrating. As we shared the wine, Patricia asked me the question that everyone seemed to be wondering about. Are you dating anyone? No, I said immediately. I'm not ready for that. Maybe I never will be. Margaret, you're 56 years old. You're successful, attractive, financially independent. You have a lot to offer someone. I also have trust issues, a complicated relationship with my ex-husband, and a daughter who's still processing her father's betrayal. Any man who wants to be part of that mess is probably not someone I'd want to date. Patricia laughed. Fair enough. But don't close yourself off to possibilities. Sometimes the life you never planned turns out to be exactly what you needed. Later that night, alone in my house, which I loved more now than I ever had when I shared it with Richard, I reflected on Patricia's words. The life I never planned. A year ago, I'd been Margaret Thompson, devoted wife and mother. Senior manager at Morrison and Associates, woman who defined herself through her relationships to other people. Now I was Margaret Thompson, business owner, financial advisor, woman who'd learned that being alone didn't mean being lonely. I'd gained things I never expected. Professional recognition, financial independence, the respect of colleagues who saw me as an expert rather than a supporting player in someone else's story. But I'd also lost things that still hurt. The comfort of a long marriage, the shared history with someone who knew me when I was young, the dream of growing old with my college sweetheart. Some nights, I miss the good parts of being married. Someone to share the small details of daily life with. Someone to watch old movies with on rainy Sundays. Someone to travel with, to plan retirement dreams with, to face the challenges of aging with. But I didn't miss the anxiety of living with someone who was lying to me. I didn't miss questioning my own instincts or making excuses for someone else's bad behavior. I didn't miss the gradual erosion of my own identity in service of someone else's dreams. On Thanksgiving, Sarah came home for the long weekend. It was our first major holiday since the divorce, and I'd been dreading it. "How weird is this going to be?" Sarah asked as we prepared dinner together in the kitchen where her father had once carved turkeys and made elaborate toasts about family traditions. "Probably very weird," I admitted. "But maybe good weird." It was good weird. Without Richard's dramatic personality dominating every conversation, Sarah and I talked more openly than we had in years. She told me about her new job, her friends in Seattle, her tentative plans for the future. I told her about my clients, my business goals, my slowly evolving sense of who I was becoming. "Mom," Sarah said as we cleaned up after dinner, "can I tell you something?" "Of course. I'm glad you didn't just forgive Dad and try to put the marriage back together." This surprised me. "Really?" "I spent years watching you make yourself smaller so Dad could feel bigger. You had all these dreams and plans that you kept putting off for his latest project or passion. Even as a kid, I could see it wasn't fair. I thought I was being a good wife and mother. You were being a good wife and mother. But you weren't being good to yourself. And I was learning that women's dreams come second to men's dreams, that women's financial security depends on men's choices, that women should be grateful for whatever they get. I never wanted to teach you that." "I know you didn't, but that's what I was learning anyway." When Dad had his affair and you fought back, when you refused to be a victim, when you built your own business and took control of your own life, that taught me something completely different. What did it teach you? That women can be strong and smart and independent, that we don't have to accept betrayal or financial abuse or public humiliation just to keep the peace, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's destructive choices. I hugged my daughter, this brilliant young woman who would never have to learn the hard way that financial independence was the foundation of every other kind of freedom. "I'm proud of you, Mom," she said. "Not just for surviving what Dad did, but for turning it into something that helps other women." That night, after Sarah had gone to bed, I sat in my study with a cup of tea and thought about the past year. A year ago, I'd been terrified. Terrified of being alone, of starting over, of not having enough money, of people judging me for my failed marriage. Now I knew better. Being alone was different from being lonely. Starting over at 56 was challenging but not impossible. I had more than enough money because I'd learned to manage it myself. And people's judgments mattered far less than my own sense of integrity. Richard had thought he was leaving me for a better life. Instead, he'd freed me to create a better life for myself. The irony was perfect. I opened my laptop and began writing an email to Patricia. Tomorrow was the start of a new week, and I had an idea for expanding Thompson Financial Consulting. Maybe it was time to start offering workshops and seminars, reaching even more women who needed to hear that financial independence was possible at any age. Maybe it was time to turn my personal story into a broader mission. The life I never planned was turning out to be exactly the life I needed. And for the first time in over a year, I was excited to see what came next. Ladies, if you've stayed with me through this entire story, I hope you've heard more than just one woman's revenge tale. I hope you've heard a reminder that you're stronger than you think, smarter than some people assume, and capable of rebuilding your life no matter what age you are when you need to start over. If you're facing betrayal, financial deception, or any major life transition, remember, document everything. Know your legal rights, and never be afraid to ask for professional help. Your future self will thank you for the preparation you do today. Most importantly, remember that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you opens the door to the best thing that could happen to you. You just have to be brave enough to walk through that door. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it helps you write your own.